So we are now recording. I'm going to go back to the slide presentation, and we'll talk about endangered species. I'm going to first ask a question. I have one more adjustment to do here on the PowerPoint, and that's your view of the slides. What I'm after is a full screen view that's filling your screen but not cut off. Can someone comment? Are you getting a good view of that slide? Somebody unmute and tell me.
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So endangered species, by now a very familiar story. Endangered species is not a concept I was raised with through my college career, but it's something you've heard about already your entire life. I think that endangered species, if you look at the outline of our course on ecology and environmental conservation, I think it's fair to say, I kind of looked at it today, it looked like there was 1/3 that was basic ecology. It looked to me like there was about 1/6 that had to do with non-human nature and the conservation of species, biodiversity, and habitats. Only 1/6. A half of the topics are topics that have to do with what I'd call human operations. Issues like water supply and quality, issues like air supply, those kinds of things that are really issues like human space. How do we use human space? So I think already the idea of human activity takes a central role, even in a course like this. So there's going to be some issues around endangered species, and I want to look at these various subtopics and try to deal with them in brief, since I think you've been introduced to them already. But pose the question for the future. The biodiversity and the species concept is sort of an ecological presentation. This is the science. How do we define, how do we talk about this issue of endangered species? And what threatens biodiversity currently? The so-called natural causes are basically historical. There were features in the history of the Earth, and here I'm talking about hundreds of millions of years ago, where biodiversity crashed and there was a huge extinction event. The big debate now is, what is the driver for our current diminishment of natural species and biodiversity? And the number one candidate is human activity. We do have a number of legal and social tools, like the Endangered Species Act, the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, and an approach called gap analysis, which tries to put our landscape preservation efforts together with our knowledge of biodiversity and kind of shift our choice of biodiversity. Also want to talk about captive breeding and survival plans as a promising approach, but very, very limited with respect to the biodiversity crisis. So here we go. Biodiversity really is above the individual level. We're not now talking about individual animals or their lives. We're talking about populations. And the biggest population, of course, is the species for any area like this coral reef. A coral reef is a very diverse, rich area that has high species diversity. The number of different species in a climax community where the resources are dependable and varied is one way of looking at a habitat and a community. Species evenness, how abundant are these species, and is that dependable? What is the trend over a short period of time of 10 years or 100 years? Is the number declining, or is the number stable, or can it be increasing? Species definitions are always difficult. In biology courses, you always talk about them. If you're interested in animals, the so-called biological species concepts that focuses on the reproductive ability among individuals is the most standard and basic. It is one that works marginally well for animals and does not work at all for the other four major groups, where vegetative reproduction, mitotic reproduction, cloning, is a viable option, and also where self-fertilization, sexual reproduction, introduces changes to the normal outcrossing that occurs in animals. Species concepts in the last 50 years have evolved more to phylogenetic and evolutionary approaches, where the most important thing is, what is the gene line, the gene pool, and what has happened within that? So there is a gene pool called primates that has given rise to various modern organisms that we might call New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, apes. Human beings are within that gene pool as a recent development. So these species concepts kind of make the issue of counting species one that can be questioned. Currently, we have 1.7 million on the books. Estimates range as low as 3 million total and as high as 50, depending on the philosophy of the taxonomist who's doing the estimate. 4 to 6 million insect species are known. Invertebrates, which we typically don't pay as much attention to as the vertebrates, those invertebrates make up about 2/3 of all known species. And I think, by the way, let me just say that is based on traditional taxonomic approaches, where microorganisms, if they look pretty much the same, we name them as one phylogenetic group. Whereas if you look at the DNA, we find considerable variation. And isn't that a nice comment on our pandemic? We've known coronaviruses. Now, by the way, I just jumped. We're not talking about organisms anymore. Viruses are not organisms, but they are a genetic line. And here we have known coronaviruses for a long, long time in our epidemiology. But this variant, COVID-19, all of a sudden brings with it a whole array of genes that allows us to bypass features of our immune system and produce an epidemic level emergency. A good question, jumping back to the living biodiversity, is where does the most biodiversity occur? Tropical rainforest and coral reefs are areas where huge numbers of species live together. We've identified hotspots for biodiversity preservation. And in fact, a major strategy in future may be to focus on those hotspots where more species are preserved when you preserve a part of the landscape or a part of the marine environment. But we do have tabulations of known and endangered species by taxonomic group. You'll notice the high endangerment by the mammals at the top. Amphibians, almost 1/3 of the amphibians that we know are endangered. Down below, the gymnosperms is a group of those needle leaf cone-bearing trees, is a group that has a relative small number of species, but because of their value for timber and material harvest, a high percentage of gymnosperms are currently considered endangered. Now, this is a good slide for us because we're interested not just in the social conversation, we're interested in our best tabulation of the science. And this represents an up-to-date tabulation of where we stand. Here's a map of those biodiversity hotspots as they've been defined and named. Now, let me make it clear. This is where we find the biodiversity. These do not represent reserves that are committed to preserving it. But the thinking is this: if you're going to save living species and biodiversity, focus on those areas which currently and in recent history have had the largest number of species available. That doesn't make this an easy job. You'll notice that in North America, there is only one hotspot, and that's the California floristic province, which extends across the Mexican border and partway down the Baja Peninsula, that being one of the 5 Mediterranean climates on the earth. So how do we want to talk about this? First of all, the benefits of biodiversity. Sorry about that typo. I'm going quick here. The benefits of biodiversity, obviously, are food supply, drugs, ecological services, such as making and retaining soil, but I quickly would add processing and purifying water, generating a healthy atmosphere. They go on and on. And aesthetic and cultural benefits, the issues of relaxation, of beauty, of entertainment that come from biodiverse habitats are pretty well known and easily imagined. Rosy periwinkle has often been held up as an example. This is a horticultural plant that occurs all over the world because of garden plantings, and it's something that has been used to generate drugs that have been effective in treatments of some kinds of cancer. Threats to biodiversity, and here we're talking about the ultimate threat would be extinction of a species. That means their disappearance forever. In the fossil record, there are major groups that where that fossil is found everywhere in rock layers that are that age, and then they simply disappear. Trilobites were an early invertebrate that disappeared from life on Earth. In a later extinction, there was a tiktaalik, an amphibian, something that shows characteristics of fish changing into amphibians, now gone from the living biodiversity on Earth. And of course, the dinosaurs represent our best known and most famous example of so-called natural extinction. Here, natural is being used in a kind of a strange way, before human beings. So the Permian period, 250 million years ago, is the largest known extinction based on the fossil record. 95% of the species on Earth disappear from the fossil record at that time. And those 5% that make it through that Permian boundary then represent the genetic stock, the common ancestors that give rise to all life after that, including us. The Cretaceous, the dinosaurs, which had ruled the Earth as the dominant animal for over 150 million years, disappeared from the Earth, along with about half the existing biodiversity at that time. So this kind of extinction is not unknown. Here's our current dilemma. We have a lot of science. We've gathered data, tabulated that data. We continue to discover new approaches to understanding the history of the Earth. We are currently counting and capturing and breeding and studying everywhere we can. That's kind of an effect of having more people that's positive. The more people you have, the more research you have going on. But the question is, and the step we have not taken, although we have done a lot to measure and to tabulate and to develop awareness of endangered species and endangered habitats, we have not taken that step to action. The question would be, are species and habitats being reserved for the future? If not, what is the scale of preservation that is reasonable, given all the needs of humanity? And how can we preserve some of this biodiversity that's currently disappearing? The second question is, can we move people's awareness to seeing the difference between real data, data that counts species and individual, how many are alive today, and what is the trend in their numbers? In a way, it's sort of like, are you looking at an automobile, or are you looking at an automobile that's moving toward a cliff? Can they see that difference? And can they see the difference between that data and one or two feel-good stories about saving a small population or even a charismatic individual? One individual is found in distress, and I've seen this on the videos, so have you, where one baby elephant is followed in the elephant herd, and all the potential dangers that it encounters in reaching an age where it's likely going to live a long life. Those are different issues. The focus on the individual or even the individual species versus the trends in species within a habitat that has a size and a biodiversity that could be self-maintaining with the right approach. So these are the mass extinctions. You can see Ordovician, Devonian, Permian, and the most recent Cretaceous. Notice the size and scale. Notice that this extinction rate is in families, not just in family, genus, and species is the rank. So this is well above species extinction. How many families of taxonomic groups disappear from the fossil record? In this century, human impact may be accelerating the rate of species decline. 2/3, 2 to 3 species per decade have been lost in recent centuries that have been documented. If present trends continue, then among major groups, and when we talk about major groups, we're talking about the more recently evolved primates and the orders of mammals. If the present trend continues, half of primates and a quarter of all birds could go in the next 50 years. 50 years is not a long time. 50 years is a period within the scope of your lives. It probably reaches beyond mine. But when I started thinking about this in my 20s, this same kind of statement applied. Nothing has been done that fundamentally turns that trend around. We have had some minor victories in recovery of rare species, but each of those has required a Herculean effort. You can see that we cannot spend that kind of money, time, and resource on a species by species approach. So this is equivalent to the rate of these extinction events that you see here. You'll notice that the scale of this is 600 million years. So when we're talking here on a scale of 50 years to 100 years, that represents an eye blink in the rate of biodiversity change. Overall statements that I think cannot be argued with. The present day extinction may be man-made. Man's success as a species represents the #1 candidate for most of our biodiversity decline. Extinction rates are accelerating. Current causes are largely generated by human actions, and even the way we talk about them does not put humans front and center. Most discussion conceals that direct link. So let's just go over these standard quote causes of extinction. Habitat destruction is pretty obvious. When you change a forest or a prairie Even when you change a desert, it interrupts the natural cycles that support the non-human biodiversity in that area. So as we build cities and farms, as we set up interstate highways, we not only use great areas of the land, but we fragment it. An interstate highway takes natural land and basically cuts it into smaller pieces. That alone can uh, endanger the living conditions of certain species. All of our human activities to support our survival and reproduction can be also viewed as habitat destruction. We also move life around. Here is just one picture of major invasive species that have been moved from their natural habitat, where natural controls are maintaining their role in biodiversity, to new habitats where there may not be any natural controls. And so these invasive species often are explosive in the way they fill a new habitat and the way they interfere with and even through competition eliminate the natural species of a new habitat, their new colonized habitat. Pollution, pretty easy to understand. Our use of pesticides, herbicides, our use of environmental toxins to support human life. Lead is a good example of something we've used in many ways, in paint, in gasoline, very, very toxic. In Missouri, the lead mine tailings that are affecting water quality are not that far south of St. Louis. Human-caused reductions from human population, just the process of expanding and building subdivisions, building homes, producing sewer systems and water systems and electric service is something that consumes habitat at a great rate. Our activities include over-harvest. The passenger pigeon was once the most numerous vertebrate in the Americas. It is now gone. The last pigeon died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1921. Her name was Martha. But overhunting and elimination has eliminated the passenger pigeon from our native biodiversity. The passenger pigeon is known historically from records of a flock. There was a record where a continuous flock without break, flew by an observer for 3 days without interruption. When a passenger pigeon flock would arrive and land in the trees, branches would break off the trees from the weight of the birds. Fish stocks and our fishing activity off of our coasts, the Grand Banks off of our northeast coast in New England, once had cod so numerous that people said it looked like you could walk across the water on the backs of the fish that were schooling there. Those stocks were fished to collapse before World War II. And World War II, because of the sinking of naval vessels and commercial vessels, those stocks recovered in about 4 or 5 years. But after the war, they were fished to a point where the Grand Banks were closed to fishing. They're now managed on a seasonal fishing and seasonal take basis. The bushmeat trade is one that continues wherever man is close to non-human environments, where humans do not exist in high numbers. But the health connections of bushmeat are very, very evident to us today. The most recent and the leading hypothesis about the source of the coronavirus is as a bushmeat transfer from bats. The dominant, the most frequently stated cause of HIV transfer was from bushmeat's trade from the green monkey in Africa. So all of these things have wide-reaching effects. Endangered Species Act was established in 1973 as a legal attempt to, in some way, address these issues. We recognize a species in trouble by three classifications. Endangerment, if we think it's right on the edge of the cliff and is going to fall off soon. Threatened, if it's likely to become, if it's edging toward that edge of the cliff state and in the near future. In other words, threatened means we have absolutely validated the decline of this species. And the absolute number of individuals doesn't matter. If I tell you there are 1 million left, that is sounds like a big number. But if I say, but 10 years ago there were 2 million, then that's a disturbing trend. Vulnerable are those that are naturally rare. There are species like the condor where numbers were low when we started observing them. Or they're locally depleted in a way that puts them at risk. So these classifications were a good way to start. How do we describe the conditions of a species? But it also tries to regulate take, which is related to the number of individuals that are being taken from nature and killed by a variety of human activities. Looking at those activities that drive this kind of reduction, like selling or collecting, including the transportation of individuals, is regulated by the Endangered Species Act. And import and export from the US is really important. I want to point out that US, if people have no money, then there's no reason to capture animals or to collect their parts and send them to those countries. The drivers of this transport and trade focus heavily on those commercially successful countries that have lots of money to spend. And it's a kind of a daunting relationship. When the Middle East became the dominant oil producing region of the world, all of a sudden there was a lot of wealth. One habit in those countries is a indoctrination and maturation ceremony for young men, where they are recognized as adults and given gifts. One of the gifts is a ceremonial dagger that they wear on their belt. The traditions of those countries is that you make the dagger in a certain way. The handle is best made from rhinoceros horn. Now, this is a mystical decision and belief. But when all of this wealth in Middle Eastern countries was combined with the presence of surplus World War II equipment in Northern Africa, then the connection led to the diminishment, endangerment, and extinction of one major subspecies of the rhinoceros. So all of a sudden, it was easy to grab an Army Jeep on an M1 rifle and drive out into these remote habitats, kill rhinos, cut off their horns, and sell them. All of those factors worked together to make the rhinoceros an endangered group. This applies to all animals and all parts of those animals. I've mentioned rhinoceros horn, the ivory tusks of elephants, and the ivory tusks of walrus. Those have driven a trade so that marine pinnipeds and elephants are in trouble because of the beauty and the desirability of those products. Currently, we have 1,300 odd endangered species and about 386 that are awaiting consideration. Now, this is something where the science and the numbers gives way to the social considerations. So that as presidents have changed in attitudes toward endangered species versus business and personal and commercial and societal uses have waffled back and forth. We have seen some Congress are willing to consider the new candidate species. Others simply set this list aside and do not act upon it, sometimes for times approaching decades. The process is slow, even when Congress is working on it. And we know of 18 species that were nominated that went extinct while they were waiting for approval. There are recovery plans by the various Fish and Wildlife, Department of Interior, conservation organizations, and many, many not-for-profits, where the numbers are clear and recommendations for species recovery have been produced. Many of these are gathering dust on shelves as we try to raise the resources and the social will to take the approach to save a species. However, there have been some notable successes. Reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone Park is a recent major mammal reintroduction that has shown some signs of being viable. However, it is clear that without continued monitoring and maintenance and adjustment of the legal restrictions, that they would quickly be driven extinct again. It's a good example, though. Wolves have produced so many positive effects on the Yellowstone environment, and as such, they have a special role, a particular species where we can rally around the reintroduction of that species, and through that, preserve a large chunk of habitat. And it is that I think is the hope of the future, going back to the biodiversity hotspot idea. We have keystone species that really represent a living component in the ecosystem that is necessary for its structure. Indicator species are species that are essential to certain communities or successional stages in the environmental change that reaches a stable and biodiverse ecosystem. Umbrella species are those that require a lot of undisturbed habitat, and so legislation about the northern spotted owl has been very, very controversial, and human activities of all types have railed against it. But if we can conserve the northern spotted owl, there's a significant amount of northwest temperate rainforest that will be preserved. Flagship species are those, we talk about it as a flagship. That's kind of the difference between, in the Navy, they talk about a showboat or a workboat. You know, the USS Missouri was a huge battleship. We signed the armistice with Japan aboard it. But in fact, it saw a lot less action than other battleships that did a majority of the fighting. That kind of flagship status is useful from a marketing and public relations standpoint to organize support. The controversy around the Endangered Species Act started with its passing. Some see it as an intrusion on human rights and primacy, and all of the professions, farmers, loggers, miners, ranchers, etc., that want to stand on the earth or sail on the ocean find some objection to it. It is not a perfect act. It is a first try, but we are still trying to reach that substantial big step. Gap analysis is shown here, and it's a simple idea, but I have to introduce it here. The red or pink colored areas are those that talk about areas of high biodiversity on the island of Hawaii. The green areas are those that are set aside for preserves. Now, those preserves obviously don't overlap the areas of high richness. So there's a gap between areas that are preserved from human activities, and they're preserved largely for the perception of human beings, their enjoyment, their landscapes, their beauty. In some cases, the fact that you can't use them to do much else. And whereas those areas that are biodiverse are ignored. And in choosing our preserves, since they must be limited, choosing those preserves needs to focus on those areas of species richness. 4 principles come from Grumbine: protect enough habitat for self-sustaining viability. Manage on a regional scale that goes above the species level. Use those as tools, but recognize you're after a bigger goal. Plan over a period of centuries so that the ecosystem can change and reach a climax community, and allow human use which does not degrade the environment, but certainly include humans in the picture. We have another treaty called the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. It regulates trade of living specimens and products of those listed species, which is another reason that listing is important. We have 700 species on that, and this is a huge international effort. This is how species are monitored, how data is collected and made available, and how basically recovery plans are generated. The CITES Convention is one that is voluntary and one that we have participated in with variable effectiveness over the decades since '75. Captive breeding in zoos gets a lot of attention, and it's important to ask yourself a question. Are we talking about a just so story, a feel-good story about our local animals? Look, they had another baby. Or is that breeding actually contributing to a restoration or a maintenance of biodiversity in the wild? In large part, I would say the most successful have been the rescue stories for things like the black-footed ferret or the California condor, where extinction was imminent, and that species remains on Earth because of captive breeding activities. I would say that the reintroduction efforts have been massive and impressive, even though they are a marginal success. This is an example, the nene, the Hawaiian goose. It was down to 30 birds migrating from the Hawaiian Islands to nesting grounds in Northern Asia and North America, and back to the Hawaiian Islands. The captive breeding program of birds is manageable because they're small. They can be done in relatively small regions. We know so much from our captive management of bird populations that they often adapt, and when they are re-released, if you can control the factors that led to their decline in the first place, this reestablishment can be somewhat successful. Our own dear to the heart story in North America is the whooping crane, which was largely eliminated down to, I believe, 21 birds when captive breeding and restriction of take rescued them from extinction. And you still can go to Aransas Pass on the Gulf Coast in Texas and see the populations of whooping cranes as a recent success. So I'm going to end the show, and then I'm going to end the recording.